Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining. We have a comrade that is joining from San Francisco, 5 o'clock in the morning, I understand. And we have comrades joining us from the Philippines, 9 p.m. But there is lots of interest, of course. So people are making all sorts of sacrifices. So thank you very much for joining. And in this first workshop of the last round of workshops, we are talking now about the chapter on labor's relationship to other social movements. And we are really, really pleased to have with us today to kickstart this series of workshops for this chapter, Peter Dwyer, who is an editor of the Review of African Political Economy. Peter developed the video lecture in a record time, so I just have to acknowledge and thank you very much, Peter, for amazing work in developing this video lecture, which is a very, very important contribution to the course. So really thank you. As always, may I please ask you to add the country you are from right under your name, so Peter can also see where people are joining from. And if possible, please do keep the cameras on, because we would want to see some faces. It always makes a difference. So Peter, perhaps we start, people have watched your video lecture, very interesting video lecture, and perhaps we start with a question that kind of points to some key insights from that video lecture. So the TAC's remarkable success rests first and foremost on its approach of building a movement of people affected by HIV/AIDS, instead of pursuing the NGOism path, right? That you just take the causes of poor people and speak on their behalf. Plus strategic alliances, you say shrewd strategic alliances, crucially with COSATU. Perhaps it would be interesting to understand what was COSATU's approach to the topic, to the issue of HIV/AIDS initially, and how did it evolve over time out of this collaboration with TAC? And at which point do you think did COSATU see this as a class issue, given that it affected particularly the Black poor population? And if you can just take us, like, how did it change COSATU, this collaboration, and how did it change TAC? So just perhaps give us a bit of a broader background to actually what you gave us in the video lecture.
Sure, thanks. I think the broader background that's important is a really key point that Peter Rossman made in his video, is that COSATU are a very good example, or were a very good example, of a labour movement that was multifaceted, a multifaceted social movement, as Peter said in his video. And so at the time, it had very deep roots, very deep social roots in South Africa, and it had that capacity to adapt and promote new demands of working class people in South Africa. And as I said in the video, COSATU had that long, proud history of fighting around broader issues than wages and employment rights, because it was a key, it was central to the anti-apartheid social movement. And so that's why the Treatment Action Campaign wanted COSATU as an ally as well. And I think COSATU probably started to take HIV as serious from about the sort of mid-1990s. It passed a Congress motion in 1998 when it committed itself to dealing with HIV/AIDS. But yeah, that main turning point was around sort of mid 1990s, I'd say, because COSATU, given its background as a social movement, it was aware of wider issues in society, and it was very deeply connected as a movement in townships and workplaces. So through its membership, it realized that people were starting to get ill through HIV, and people then were starting to die through AIDS as well. So it realized that at that level, but then it also realized that this had, major social and economic impacts as well, and it made those apartheid and post-apartheid inequalities even worse. So if you were poor and Black under apartheid, you were still poor and Black in post-apartheid South Africa, and now being hit with the sort of the issue of HIV/AIDS, which was, was making people sick. They're off work. the statistic at one point was that about one worker's wage at the time fed about 10 people in their extended family, as is the way in households and networks in the global south. So as the epidemic spread, it became clearer to COSATU's leadership and its members that it was massively disproportionately affecting working class people in South Africa. And just to point on working class, I was thinking about this, maybe perhaps for comrades in the global south, comrades in the global north, comrades in the global south will know that working class here, I think, really means a much broader idea of what the working class is. It's not just people who are working and lucky to have a job in some countries like South Africa. It's their families and their extended families. And so I always used to say, talking to activists in South Africa, that the unemployed and workers were connected by an umbilical cord, like a mother and child are connected through an umbilical cord. The employed and unemployed were connected through an umbilical cord of class in these countries. And so if someone was working, then a wider network got more food on the table. If someone was then made unemployed or ill through HIV or died, then again, that affected a wider network of people. And South Africa at the time, and still has, near permanent unemployment of 30%. So this was a huge issue in the country because it, as I say, it particularly affected Black South African families, working class families. And I think this is kind of linked to a point that I'm sure others have made, is that particularly again in the global south with high levels of unemployment and informal employment, the unions were trying to grapple with the idea of making links between the unemployed and workers. And in some senses, this brought that home, because if people were made unemployed, it then, through HIV and AIDS, then it really impacted on everybody as well. And so that it sort of highlighted that tension as well, because that's an issue that maybe we'll talk about later that's not really been dealt with sufficiently, I think, in South Africa, that links between unemployed people and workers. But again, the HIV epidemic has brought that home, because people were literally ill and, were dying in great numbers. So people were losing that wage in those families as well. The question of when did COSATU recognize it as a class issue is a difficult one. I mean, at its best, COSATU, implicit will have seen that as a class issue, even if at times they may not have articulated it as that, because they would have aware of who it affected. So for them, anything that affects the working class is a class issue. I wouldn't say that they spoke about HIV as a class issue in its own right, but I think they would have seen it as part of a broader set of issues that affected the working class, because COSATU was always clear that there was a big Black working class and that they were, a leading force that worked with and spoke for the working class. They didn't just see themselves as spokespeople or working with the employed section of the working class. They would talk about the working class in a wider sense. As I've just said, whether they've done that sufficiently enough it is something that needs to still be spoken about. But I think what COSATU would have most definitely been aware of was, and again, I think Fred Cooper mentioned it in his talk about the strike waves in the 1940s and 50s, that trade unions can have a much bigger impact on politics over and above the size of the trade union or the official labour force. So COSATU, like others, didn't represent the whole of the organised working class. It probably at its height had about 2 million members at the time. It was starting to align itself with the Treatment Action Campaign. But it had that really big social weight, so it could punch much higher, punch much bigger. In some ways, I used to think about the sort of David and Goliath parable from the Bible, is that, COSATU and unions in the global south are often smaller compared to the Goliath of the sort of wider bosses and the wider capitalist system, but they can certainly punch above their weight. So the COSATU is very much thinking and acting like that as well. So yeah, I wouldn't say they spoke about it in directly class terms, but they were very clear. Look, the impact on workers was that they were represented was huge, because more and more people were getting sick, and and terribly more and more people started to die in huge numbers, as I talked about in the talk as well. So they were aware it affected them in that sense. They were aware that the healthcare system in South Africa the public sector was massively underfunded, understaffed, didn't have enough resources, and then comes along the growing epidemic of HIV, which puts a huge pressure on an already inadequate healthcare system. And so that affected workers in a class sense. And of course, especially those that were, were the lower end of the pay scales in poorer working conditions. And this made them particularly vulnerable to HIV because, without going into the science and medicine of it, the poorer you are, the more likely you were to HIV, and the more likely you were to die from it because you couldn't get access to those drugs. Because you've already got not a particularly healthy lifestyle, a particularly well body, then if you catch HIV, the immune system is suppressed, and so you'll die a lot quicker. So in that sense, it was a class issue, and even within the working class, there was almost like a sort of a differentiated impact as well, because the poorer you were, the more likely you were to catch it, the more likely and quicker you were literally to die. So it was a class issue in that sense. It was a class issue in terms of access to healthcare. And I guess in a more sort of broader sense, COSATU were always talking about the link between, poor wages, poverty, and economic inequality. And so they made that link with TIC and how that spread HIV as well. So, they were very clear that the economic structures, if you like, of apartheid, which were inherited, had already left lots of working class communities in poverty, and that facilitated the spread of HIV. So in that sense, it was what was a class issue. But, in a way that you pose the question, when do they see it as a class issue? I wouldn't say they saw it and said, we need to talk about this in the class issue. They would have intimately seen it as a class issue and talked about the working class and how it affected the working class.
Well, thanks very much for that. Really, really helpful to perhaps really now start the conversation. So we have one question in the chat box, and I'll give people some time to gather their thoughts. Please raise your hand, either virtually or proper hand. We'll try to keep an eye on everybody's face, and or put the question in the chat box. So we have a question from the comrade from Russia. Sergey, would you want to do it, or you want me to read it? Okay, I read it. Yeah, okay. COSATU is a big confederation of trade unions. Can you say that some trade unions in COSATU were more involved in the TAC? Maybe NUMSA, doctors' unions, health workers' unions, none or less so. Could you see a profile of the sector where the unions are coming from in terms of engagement?
Yeah, I think some of the bigger unions like NUMSA were more involved in everything in COSATU, and definitely more involved as well. At a national level, the leadership were most definitely involved, and they genuinely bought into this. I think at the different levels and more down at the grassroots levels, then the impact was very different. And again, that was often linked to stigma as well. That was a major issue. So at the senior level, I think all the unions bought into it and were involved in making policy and involved at the meetings and genuinely supported it. Again, amongst the membership, it was a much different issue. I think in and around Durban, where I was based at one time, the unions there were all very involved because it really was, Durban, and literally one township in Durban, was the epicenter of the global pandemic. There was actually one township called Marion Hill near the motorway in Durban, and epidemiologists have said that's the center of the global pandemic of HIV. So there was definitely that sense in Durban of an involvement as well. But yet it's definitely, I think the main difference really was at a leadership level and a grassroots level. And in part, that also reflected the tension inside COSATU with its relationship to the ANC and the relationship to TAC as well, because TAC were much more prepared to be critical of the ANC at the time than COSATU were. I mean, things have moved quickly since then. But if you think 1998, it was still very early days in terms of the transition to the new South Africa, and COSATU were much less willing generally to criticize the ANC, although this was one of the first issues that they did start to criticize the ANC about. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any question from or comment from the room? I know. Yes, Gifford, go ahead.
Yeah, in your video lecture, you talked about the contradiction and the kind of um, reluctance of some factions of perhaps of the trade unions to do civil disobedience. And here in the US where I live, like this group ACT UP, which is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, had to push against in the United States just denial of the crisis, a lot of based on homophobia. And they were all about direct action and these kind of civil disobedience, including in 1987 when they went to the New York Stock Exchange and sat in and chained themselves. And it just really was a brilliant tactical move to create awareness. And I wonder if there were any overlaps, and if you could also talk about the lack of the reluctance for some groups in South Africa to do civil disobedience.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, the reluctance was definitely there from the outset for COSATU. As I just mentioned before, they were still in the period where they were a lot less willing to be publicly critical of the ANC. Tensions were already emerging because around 1996, the ANC had released its big major macroeconomic policy shift called GEAR, Growth, Employment and Redistribution, which really was, as activists labeled it, a homegrown structural adjustment policy. So COSATU were very angry with that, as were the Communist Party, and started to raise criticism. So we saw some early tensions there. These tensions were then deepened, if you like, around the issue of HIV. And as TAC and COSATU started to campaign more, the reluctance from certainly the Thabo Mbeki government from 1999 onwards, when there was a shift in the ANC as well, certainly the leadership level, to be much more reluctant to see the connection between HIV/AIDS and Thabo Mbeki, and some of his leading ministers became pretty much outright HIV denialists. And so that created further tension. So yeah, there was always that reluctance from COSATU. So at one level, at the top level, they would say, we need to campaign around HIV/AIDS. When an alliance with Treatment Action Campaign, the alliance was genuine and serious. I don't want to take away from that. But then as the ANC leadership and government started to kick back against the movement, then the tensions inside the alliance between TAC and COSATU started to emerge, and TAC would, be happy to pull some of the publicity stunts and have die-ins and publicly embarrass the government and ministers and mobilize them, without a doubt, very much like ACT UP, and I'm sure that's where they took some of their lessons from. Don't forget, one of the original founders of TAC was Zaki Ahmad, who was an openly gay HIV positive activist as well. So I've no doubt, as a socialist and internationalist, he was aware of ACT UP and learned lessons as well. So yeah, those tensions definitely emerged. And again, those tensions were further exacerbated as the HIV sort of AIDS denialist sort of small sort of network inside Thabo Mbeki's government started to dominate after 1999. And yeah, that was definitely a tension. And again, that fed into the wider tensions. I've no doubt that COSATU did think, and we know they thought Thabo Mbeki and the ANC leadership were wrong to say what they said. However, they always had to try and cut their cloth to not fall out over wider issues and to keep that tripartite alliance going with COSATU, the African National Congress, and the South African Communist Party. So yes, this issue exacerbated those growing tensions. I think it deepened them and widened them a little bit. And if we were to fast forward a further 10, 15 years, we've seen, those tensions really blow wide open, although COSATU is still part of that alliance. And that was one of the tensions between TAC and the wider, small growing number of social movement organizations that weren't aligned to the ANC, who were campaigning against water privatization and things like that. They were always critical of TAC for not being critical enough of COSATU and the ANC as well. So there were tensions all around, actually, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I think very important also for the discussion we are having in this chapter, which goes really to the relationship of labor to all sorts of social movements and that internal tensions. But okay, so any other question? I don't know if there was something in there. But there is one from Ronald. Ronald, do you want to make the question yourself? Or You have internet connections. I can't remember who said that, but Peter, you read that. Why was there fierce resistance from ANC government to provide ARV at the time? Millions of lives was lost. Was it arrogance or? And perhaps that brings us also, I think Ale had a few questions about, you know, the trade, the broader trade agreements, free trade agreements issues, and pharmaceutical companies' power and so on.
Yeah, I can do it after you reply to Ronald or whatever you want.
Let's do it now, Ale, because I think it is related also to this one.
Okay. Well, I mean, you mentioned in the video lecture that there was this lawsuit from the pharmaceutical companies to the government. I wanted you to tell us about the resistance strategy towards that enterprise strategy. And also I wanted to know if this is linked somehow to the fight that the South African government held in the WTO conference against patents for COVID vaccines. How is it interrelated, if it has some relationship, the TAC movement with this one, with this fight? That was very well known, I think, or at least I do.
Yeah, great questions, thanks. I mean, that first initial question about why didn't they just automatically give antiretrovirals to people because, you know, their people are dying, it's black people, you know, it seems a no-brainer. And again, that's interesting because it's really exposes that idea that political parties, no matter who they are, and don't, you know, we must remind ourselves that the ANC were full of heroes and heroines of the liberation struggle. These were not the professional politicians we see that dominate party politics in most of the world today. These were politicians that run guns undercover. These were politicians that had been tortured. Their families had been tortured. You know, I interviewed politicians who'd been stood naked on blocks of ice and interviewed for hours of a weekend in a prison. They then go into government, so they're imbued with this real struggle. You know, you couldn't get a more real set of activists going into government than went into Mandela's first government. And yet we see how they changed and compromised. And this was a real test issue, wasn't it? You know, people were literally dying in their hundreds of thousands and predicted to die in their millions. Yet they were still dragging their feet about giving free drugs to their people. It begs that question, why? And I think it's down to politics. The politics of the African National Congress were politics that by the time they got to power were increasingly becoming at best left of center and more centrist in terms that we talk about today. I think this was exemplified in the massive macroeconomic shift that I mentioned in 1996-97, where they committed to a homegrown structural adjustment policy or homegrown neoliberal policy, where they showed that to try and get investment into South Africa after the end of apartheid, they were prepared to show big business and capital around the world that they were not going to threaten their profits. They were not going to threaten their property rights. They were not going to threaten, and as it proved, their intellectual property rights. And they were only threatening that once they were pushed by this brilliant social movement of TAC and COSATU, that they then pushed back against the multinationals who wouldn't allow them to produce a free generic drug. So that's also something we mustn't forget. On one hand, we must commend the government for at least taking on the multinationals, but on the other hand, they only took them on because they were pressured from the outside by COSATU and by the Treatment Action Campaign and their activism and campaigning. So I think that's really important. You know, why didn't they automatically give the drugs? Because of their political and economic commitments at the time, which were clearly shifting to the center, again, as exemplified by their own homegrown structural adjustment policy. In terms of how did TAC resist the multinationals, again, both with inside and outside activism, which I think is important. I think one of the weaknesses of many of us, me included in the past and when I lived in South Africa, was that we thought Treatment Action Campaign were doing too many inside deals. They were They were having too many meetings inside government rather than being outside and kicking down the doors of government. Actually, in hindsight, they were brilliant. They done both. And they got an awful lot of criticism from more left-wing activists, social movements, outside of the alliance in COSATU and the Communist Party for being too much inside. But actually it worked. They saved millions of lives. And, this exercise of reading back has made me realize just how right those tactics were. But of course, they were tactics were full attention. So you're back to your question, Alejandra. They worked with lawyers. They worked with lawyers who were activists, who got into universities. The VITS Law Project was brilliant at looking at policy and legal gaps and loopholes. So they worked very clearly around that. And they looked at the Constitution, which was a new constitution, one of the most liberal in the world. So they looked for holes, or they pushed the rights that were written down, said, look, we're entitled to good healthcare. Give us the good healthcare. So they just played the ANC at their own game. Meanwhile, they kept trying to kick down the doors, and they would do direct action and mobilize people and have protests and embarrass ministers and the government and get all over the media. So it was a dual prong a strategy that, as I say, I must be honest, I was critical of at the time. So I can't deny that. I don't want to make me out to be some person who got it right then. But I think in hindsight, it worked brilliantly, and all power to them. In terms of the relationship to COVID, yeah, it's a really good question. I think clearly that would have been in their minds without a doubt. I mean, the COVID pandemic broke out at a time when the ANC were increasingly losing in the polls, and that was again proven to be correct in the recent elections in 2024, where their vote dropped to the lowest ever. So they would have been very mindful that they've got a constituency that's always prepared to mobilize, that there was a history of that. I think the history of Treatment Action Campaign and COSATU was living proof that those alliances can work. So they would definitely been aware of that. And that's when they would have, and they were very forthright in arguing for more vaccines for the global south, and South Africa done a bit better than others. I mean, again, to be fair to people like Cyril Ramaphosa, they do have those politics of the sort of global south where they know that the world is massively uneven politically and geopolitically, and they know they've got to go and fight for everything they can get, in terms of resources from the more dominant imperial powers. So yeah, it would have been part of the ANC's politics, to be fair, that we fight for our right to get vaccines from the global north. And then also they would have been mindful nationally that they would have been, it would have been quite easy for people to mobilize and kick them up the backside if they weren't making the demands that people thought they should have.
Thanks very much. We have Peter has raised his hand, and I see a question from Bill. So perhaps I get Peter first, and Bill, perhaps you make the question yourself, so instead of the chat, unless you have a problem with but Peter, you go first.
Well, since Alejandra raised it, people have forgotten about that 2001 lawsuit and what it actually meant. And it's often and correctly described as a lawsuit brought by multinational pharmaceutical companies. But we can't forget the South African pharmaceutical industry was also a party to that lawsuit. And amongst the 40 or so companies that brought suit against South Africa, in which President Mandela was personally named, as an object of the suit, only a small number of them actually manufactured retrovirals, either under patent or generically. It was very much an act that was designed to draw a line in the sand, that there would be no challenge to intellectual property. And so that in turn raised a discussion inside the WTO about the conditions under which intellectual property rights could be temporarily waived in the context of an epidemic, for example. And the solution was far from satisfactory. it's extremely difficult for countries to either access or to manufacture generics in the context of an epidemic, a pandemic, or just a large number of illnesses. And that is why when the COVID pandemic began, India and South Africa and a couple of other countries from the global south again tried to make a fight inside the WTO and inside the United Nations system. And they failed, essentially, which is why so many people died during the initial phase of the pandemic, when it would have been feasible to manufacture large quantities of vaccines, but the industry stopped it. So I just think those points are worth recalling. And that architecture that protects pharmaceutical knowledge as part of a wider defense of intellectual property is still with us and will be with us when the next pandemic comes. So it's worth thinking about all these things and not letting that lawsuit drop from memory, because that was really a pivotal event.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. But I could just say, I mean, it's implied in what you said. I think, we talked about why didn't the ANC government do what seemed morally right, and we can be frustrated at that. But what we shouldn't forget is that despite their intransigence, the legal and political implications of that lawsuit were incredible. I mean, it really exposed what multinational corporations are about, because they said that, the South African government's legal argument was that their new constitution and health laws allowed them to override patents in the public interest. The pharmaceutical companies turned around and said, no. Enforcing patient rights was important for their investments in drug development. Yeah, we get that. But actually, they wanted the right to sell at a higher rate to produce profit. I mean, the anti-capitalist movement slogan in the mid to late 90s of people before profit was there for everyone to see here. The multinational corporations, there was no conspiracy. They were like, our profits come first. Now, they never said this, but what it meant was people can die. If you can't afford it, people can die. And boy, did they die in their hundreds of thousands and millions. And, it really shows how disgusting the multinationals are. And no matter what they say, they are really about profit and not about people. And this case really exposed that. If we didn't need more evidence, we had plenty anyway. But this really gave us more evidence, tragically.
And outrageous, of course. Bill, go ahead.
Okay, my question is just purely about social movements uniting with trade unions. Is there a factor that you see that comes down to how the trade unions are structurally integrated to the political system of a country? Because I'm thinking of countries where trade unions are intimately tied to political governance fabric. So like the UK, you have the Labour Party, or in South Africa with COSATU as a member of ANC. Does that make it easier for then unions to be able to merge with larger social causes? Because for members of the union, they feel they can pressure their immediate trade union leaders, and even the trade unions themselves within the governance party. For example, if they're in power, they must be more responsive to larger issues than just wages and working conditions. Because in countries where that doesn't exist, is that not a unique challenge? Because if such organizations are just part of the civil society, someone would actually ask, why are we caring about this issue, yet we have so many other things that we are struggling with? So that's just, I'd want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's a really important question. And it gets down to the sort of classic debate around what is the fundamental role of the labour movement and what should its relationship be to party politics. Because for decades in the founding of labour movements, as Peter talked about and Fred talked about in their videos, they've automatically been linked to the more progressive left parties of the world. And certainly in liberation movements, they've always been linked to the leading Liberation Party. That obviously has been increasingly questioned over time in the global north, and it's been increasingly questioned in post-liberation societies. In terms of South Africa, then it was clear that COSATU were a real help to the treatment action campaign, and that's because of its connections to the ANC, so it could have a foot inside government through its own. COSATU sent a number of leaders into government. COSATU was part of the National Economic Development Forum, NEDLAC, that I mentioned in the video, so it gave them a foot inside with business in that sort of corporatist arrangement. So in that sense, the corporatist arrangements could work, but I think where COSATU didn't press its strength enough was in mobilizations. And that's where I think TAC kind of lit a fire under the feet of COSATU and kept them honest. And so their direct actions, their protests, in a way shamed the ANC, but they also partly shamed COSATU as well. So I think it was good that the TAC done that. So yes, there's no doubt COSATU's connections inside government really helped, but I think that also exposed their weakness in that they were too timid to criticize the government, because this really was, the issue of the time, people literally dying in their droves. And I think without TAC, and also at the time, there were other smaller social movements that were very militant, that although not very big, but were very militant and active. And I think they were putting pressure on the government as well. And although TAC refused to align itself to those more radical, independent, much smaller social movements, that also created a broader environment of increasing pressure on the ANC at the time. And I think that raises your question, Bill, raises a much wider issue of around how do unions going forward strategically align themselves with particular parties. And I think that's got to be a question that's down to each particular country in its moment in time and space. I think the days of labor movements automatically giving their support to what would be seen as their natural allies in a leftish party, I think they're increasingly questioned more than ever, because leftist parties have still continued to drift to the center in many, many countries across the world. My own country now is a brilliant but tragic example, because we've seen a shift much further to the right under Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And I think we've seen that tragically in many other countries. Personally, I think the Labour movement should always be independent of political parties, unless that political party meets all the requirements of the Labour movement, whatever those particular demands are. But I think independence is key for all sorts of reasons. And I think history has proven that. And I think eventually, if Labour movements stay too close to the governing party, they will inevitably be forced to compromise. I think there's a second wider issue that we haven't mentioned, is part of the growing bureaucratization of Labour movements. It's interesting, COSATU took its model, and many of the early trade unions in South Africa took their model, as they did in Kenya and elsewhere where you are, from the British trade union movement. And that, I think, was always a strength. But there did become a point in the British trade union movement and elsewhere where we've seen the trade union movement become increasingly conservative with a small c, and increasingly bureaucratized. And I think that became a barrier to its continued radicalism. And that also dovetailed with its constantly aligning itself with what would have been seen as the most leftist party in its country. So there's a question of that strategic alliance, but also there's a question of what does the growing bureaucratic structure of the Labour movement, what impact does that have on its politics as well? And I think that's something that is an issue for all of us. And again, we see it in COSATU. At its height, it was, as I say, 2 million people, but it did become increasingly bureaucratized. It was increasingly criticized internally and externally for having well-paid jobs, having its own fat cats, its own people becoming out of touch with the shop floor. And I'm sure everyone on the call now will sound familiar to them as a criticism of their own Labour movement. And that certainly is what's happened in South Africa. So I think there are two issues there in terms of your question. The strategic issue of should they align with those political leftist parties automatically, because it does give an advantage, and I think it did in South Africa over HIV and antiretrovirals. However, that does come with a tension. And I think that also raises the issue of the bureaucratization and the conservatism of Labour movements.
Thanks, Peter. I think we did have a bit this discussion about the extent to which the unions get integrated into corporatist structures and the bureaucratization that follows, like almost like a logical outcome of that integration in corporatist structures, because you would need to control really the whole structure to be part of the corporatist system. So the two are more interlinked than what we would think. But there is a question from Ronald in the chat box. I don't know whether you can read that, Peter.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to speak to that a bit, and we take also Comrade Ayode. Please go ahead.
So do you want me to go first?
No, I thought perhaps we get two questions. Ayode, do you go first? Go ahead, please.
If you said so, I'll go. Should I go? Okay, thank you. I just want to ask a question concerned to the political party and the union organizations. For example, in UK, we have a Labour Party. Even here in Nigeria, we have Labour Party too that was being championed by Nigeria Labour Congress here. And if you look at this together with the politics, because the politics and the unionism are not really go pari passu. There's a defined line when they are trying to act for the right of their members. So on this note, how did we manage the two together to achieve for workers, or we should separate it? We should separate a political party from the union organization. Thank you.
Yeah, I think again that's an ongoing strategic political question. I think all we can say is that as I said before, the days of automatically a links between a leftist party, particularly if it's called the Labour Party, does no longer signify that it is a party of Labour. That's certainly the case in the UK, and I know it's happening elsewhere. So I think political parties have to win over the trust and respect of the Labour movement rather than the other way around. And I think the Labour movement must always retain the right to withdraw any support for any political party, be it in government or not, at any time that it sees fit. Because, history has shown us time and time again that these political parties, particularly once they get in government, they often change. They are often, sadly, pulled to the right. Now, we could say that's a weakness of the wider Labour movement and social movement for not keeping them honest. And I think that's something we could debate. But I do think, the days of the natural alliances are well and truly over. There may be some exceptions in countries around the world, but, that again, we'd have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But I do think the Labour movements of the world need to go back to their origins. I know some of the others in the videos will have spoken about them as well, and keep that independence, because that was also a time of much more radicalism. And, people might say, well, the days of fighting for economic rights and political rights, the right to vote in many parts of the world are over. But there are always new and shifting issues that the Labour movement must take up, be it COVID, be it, the shift to the populist right that we're now seeing, which is really an attack on democracy. And I think if you look at many centrist leftist governments or parties around the world, they're far too soft on this shift. And I think the independent workers movement needs to keep that independence so that it can act and operate in the interests of the wider working class. I mean, that really is my own opinion. In terms of the question about why haven't antiretrovirals sort of solved the problem, I mean, I did mention briefly that HIV now is globally seen as a sort of more long-term illness. It's like a chronic illness, like asthma or diabetes. It's no longer needs to be a death sentence, particularly in the global south. Of course, in the global north, people won that fight for ARVs many years ago, and the vast majority people with HIV in the global north do not die of AIDS. There's still far too many people in the global south dying of AIDS because of lack of access to antiretroviral drugs. But yeah, there isn't a medical cure yet for HIV, but it's not far off it. I mean, I know lots of activists and friends in South Africa, and one of them is Viseka Debula, used to be the general secretary for Treatment Action Campaign. She has since had several children which were born without being HIV. And that wasn't the case many years ago in South Africa. I have friends now, and indeed a former partner who was HIV positive, and she was telling me recently, she's since had a child as well. She was telling me recently, you know, if she took an HIV test today, in all likelihood, it would show up that she was negative. Such is the strength of the antiretroviral drugs now. That, you know, again, it wouldn't show up in her blood system. And also the way in which those drugs have developed is brilliant, because actually at the time when I met her, she started on antiretrovirals and they made her really sick. In fact, nearly killed her because it was very difficult to get the balance right early on. And they used to adjust the sort of strength of the antiretroviral drugs along with other medicines. And once that's done, people live absolutely normal lives like everybody else. So yes, there's no cure yet. I don't think there's a conspiracy by the multinationals not to make a cure. I think if they could make a cure, they would, because there's plenty of money in that anyway. So I just think it's a case that they haven't got there yet, but still they pretty much are very close to it as well. But of course, you know, it always comes at a cost, and for them still, you know, profits must come first.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions in the chat box, Peter. Perhaps you take a look at that and how do you want to reflect? But we are also towards the end, so I want to pick up a bit on what Peter Rossman was telling just before we started about the Secretary of Health picked by Trump, who is not just a vax denier, but is also anti-HIV. What was that, Peter, that is denying that the connection between HIV and AIDS? And what do we learn from South Africa's case? Because South Africa, the TAC also emerged and succeeded out of very brutal environment, if you like, of homophobia, but also of all sorts of denialism and so on. So, and racism, structural racism. What do we learn from this example in the TAC? What could the US social movements learn and trade unions? And please feel free to comment on anything on the chat box.
Sure. Well, I mean, given I think ACT UP taught the world a lot of tactics about campaigning around HIV, AIDS, and homophobia, I think probably there, in one sense, they just need, you know, organizations need to learn from their past. Sometimes I think we often as activists, and I'm struggling with this now in the UK, we have to think of something constantly new and different in order to, you know, connect in the way that we haven't been. But sometimes we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to study our own history. And that's what I've really liked about this unit and the Global Labour Union. It doesn't say history has all the answers, but we may pick up some lessons, and, you know, if we apply them carefully and creatively today. But I think the biggest lessons looking back for me is just how smart Treatment Action Campaign were. But they were militantly smart. They were smart in the way that they organized a particular tactical alliance, and they were smart in the way that they were prepared to argue with their comrades in COSATU and elsewhere. And indeed, they were prepared to argue with the smaller social movements to tax left, because there was a wider left social movement growing at the time, and they were prepared to criticize them and say, no, we're on the right path, being both inside and outside the alliance through COSATU has helped us. But look, we're prepared to criticize our comrades. And they were, and they did. And I think that paid off. But I think the broader issue that really struck me, and I think I ended the video on this, was that we must never, ever underestimate that even the most poorest and marginal people, you know, who were literally shunned in South Africa at the time, and still are, but nowhere near as much, that they stood up proudly and fought back. And I didn't get time to mention it, and maybe it was in some of your images, But I would like to present a global case, if you like, for the Treatment Actions Campaign T-shirt, which said simply HIV positive in big writing. I think that's probably one of the greatest political T-shirts, if not of all time, certainly of the late 20th century. And it was great because it was simple, it was bold, but by God, it took some nerve to wear that in a country that was deeply violent, deeply misogynistic. And as I said in the video, people were killed for being HIV positive. Yet, you know, it was easy for me as a white, effectively middle-class foreigner to wear that T-shirt, okay? But for women, particularly women, to walk in townships with that T-shirt on, I just think showed incredible bravery. But I think they took their bravery from the wider movement that TAC built and the education and campaigns that they built that emboldened those people to wear those T-shirts. And I'll never forget till the day I die, walking on a march of only a couple of hundred at one point in Cape Town. And towards the back were a bunch of men who worked with CASATU, they worked with the Communist Party, and they weren't even members of TAC, I found out. And they had blankets around them, which is a signal of being a sort of poorer person. And underneath was that HIV positive T-shirt that was covered up at the start of the march. And by the end of this small march, the blanket was off and they were walking with the T-shirt on. And I just thought how brilliant of them to do that, but how brilliant that a social movement could give them the confidence to walk around like that at a time when it was really difficult. And so that's the brilliance of collective power. That's the brilliance of organization, political campaign, and education. At our best, it's incredible what we can do for each other. And I think Treatment Action Campaign was us at our best and was a great example of what we can do as a collective movement.
Thanks, Peter. God, there are too many things in the chat box. I don't know whether you would want.
And I think that Ronald's question is the base of the discussion. It was capitalism and its architects have sacrificed human life on the altar of profits. Why is there no cure for HIV yet? I think you already replied to that, but there's been a debate. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I mean, I'm obviously no supporter of any multinational corporations, and I think that they always do put profit before people. That will never change. That is why capitalism exists. That's why these giant multinational corporations exist. I don't think that means we can write them all off as some sort of devil that can never help the people, because clearly they can. I mean, all of us are living longer generally. And particularly in the global south, because of the advances in science and medicine, and multinational corporations have played a role in that. I think, of course, as someone's mentioned in there, many multinational corporations do get funding from their governments. And I think there's an argument there that we don't talk about enough. In fact, the COVID vaccine invented here in Oxford, where I'm living, 2 miles from my house, that seed money was from the British government. It was the taxpayer that funded the creation of the COVID vaccine. I think we forget that. It wasn't a private corporation. It was tax-funded organisation. And Oxford University also receives money from the taxpayer in the UK. So there is that connection there. So I don't think multinational corporations or pharmaceuticals are devils, but neither are they angels. They can be a bit of both. Of course, what affects that is the pressure and power from us from the outside. And so as long as they exist, we have to deal with them, and we have to be strategic and tactical about that. But I think it's too simplistic to just write them off, because we need them, because at the moment, the way that they do monopolize the pharmaceutical sector, we have to campaign and deal with that. I mean, one of the great things about the protest movement in South Africa, and of course, I would never advocate violence, but activists went and burned down the office of, I think, of one of the big pharmaceutical companies in Durban. They just set it on fire and said, we're not having this. And so, they need to keep themselves honest, and they are aware of the pressure. This was a test case. It was global. People in that world will know about it. So pharmaceutical companies have to try and be honest in one sense. But of course, we know underlying the pressure from them will be to make profits. And so morality will always come second. I was always told once that, You know, organizations like pharmaceutical companies, they may, you know, their heart may be on the left, but their pocket is always on the right, politically and metaphorically. So, you know, that's what will always govern how they rule. But yeah, we have to work with them. We have to campaign with them. We can never rely on them, but ultimately, you know, I think we need to take them over, and that's, you know, we need to nationalize them and run them in the interest of the people and not in the interests of profit. And that's part of our ongoing general struggle. But we'll never get to that if we don't win many of the smaller battles around, you know, things like antiretrovirals, and we mustn't forget bread and butter issues as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it brings us to the bigger discussion about the health as a right, and then which one takes priority. And but Peter, perhaps we are in the last minutes. I don't know whether you have a question or a comment. No, okay. We're just wrapping up, Peter. We have really an excellent video lecture by Peter Rossman in the course Regulating Global Supply Chain, which is really about this question, the question of property rights and intellectual property rights, and the question of vaccines. So I would invite everybody who is interested to revisit that video, and it's clear that we need that conversation. But just in terms of looking forward, what it seems to me the case from South Africa shows is also the importance of movement, of finding a common ground to work together. Different movements, those in the radical left, are just as important to push the other movements or to keep them to their toes, as you say, all the time, so you don't fall into some sort of complacency if you achieve a small victory. And I think that's something, perhaps also to your final words on that, how important, you reiterated, but of course, how important is that even for other issues, that we always have these organizations, it could be even fringe, but that are all the time articulating even the more radical demands, such as why should the multinationals exist, especially in health sector or water, or, you know, the key sectors of the economy. Why are these groups so important? And that we don't fight each other in the left, but that we actually try and find the way to work together towards the forces of capital.
Yeah, no, that is the key question for us going forward. And I'm not sure if there's any comrades on from Latin America, but I'm sure I was in Brazil one time, and I picked up the saying that you know, we should do our talking while we're walking. And that was an idea that, you know, there are many things we can agree on, so let's march and mobilize and work on them. And in the process, let's argue about the things we don't agree on, but let's focus on the things we do agree upon. And I think that was something that TAC tried to do as well. And I think the social movement left outside of TAC in some ways didn't learn that lesson. However, they have been, the social movement left outside of TAC, they have been proven absolutely right at the political level. The ANC were continually shifting to the right. There was no way they were going to change. They're beyond change. And in fact, they were critical of COSATU, saying that COSATU were being pulled to the right due to their strategic alliance. Now, history has proven that correct. The ANC have continually shifted to the right. They have shown themselves beyond change. And including COSATU, there has since been a split in COSATU, and a new, more radical left-wing trade union federation split away from COSATU. So at the political level, those debates, I think, looking back, you know, activists around the other social movements like Trevor Ngwani and Ashwin Desai, people like them can say we were right. However, in many ways, they didn't have the social impact that TAC did. They won lots of little victories. They got people, you know, back into their houses. They stopped them getting evicted, things like that. Stopped water connections being, you know, got water connected back or electricity connected back, as Trevor Ngwani and the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee did. However, TAC saved millions of lives, literally saved millions of lives. And, you know, I think that's an important lesson as well. So you've got to argue about the big picture, strategic politics, the ideological issues. You've got to also get involved in the bread and butter issues. And there's a relationship between the two. You know, there's an old saying in the British trade union movement, if you can't win an inch, you'll never win a mile. And I think that's important for all of us to remember. Of course, it's very easy for me to sit here and talk about it in the abstract and say, this is what we must do. We must unite around what we can work together on and argue later on. But of course, I think that's, that's something we must strive towards and do. It's really, really important. And I think today's issue of, the scourge and rise of fascism is an important issue. There are many things I would disagree with some people around political issues, but if we can unite against fascism and racism, then we must unite in one movement, and we must do our talking whilst we're walking. I.e., let's argue about something else while we're saving people from being attacked by fascists.
Yeah, well, fantastic ending of the conversation. I think very important for us, wherever we are, of course, for our comrades in Argentina, facing an almost fascist government right now. But all of us, we are facing increasing authoritarianism in our own countries. So really important learnings. Thanks so much, Peter. Thanks everyone for the participation, for questions and comments, and for all the learnings that we are constructing together. So really, really important. We meet tomorrow in the next workshop. Until then, stay safe.